Hi and welcome. And yes, indeed, it is a hot topic, the issue of supply chain management and how to make sure that your suppliers follow your own social responsibility vision and mission and implement the values that you might have as an organization, because social responsibility doesn't end at your factory gate or your company office door, but goes beyond that. And of course, it has certain impacts what your suppliers do also on you. And you want to make sure that there are no risks within the supply chain. That's one aspect. And of course, you want to make sure that the product or the claim that you make to be a socially responsible organization actually is a true claim. Because if your suppliers are not following that or not interested in that, your claim might get some question marks if the reality then looks different. First of all, I want to show you a little film just as an intro to the topic, and I guess you will like it. Well, yes, that's what can happen in a situation of outside world. Everything is shiny and bright, but what's happening underneath in the underground might be very different. And that's the risk that a lot of organizations have. We actually had once a client who was or is the largest supplier to Disney and is producing in Vietnam. And companies do, in the meantime, quite strongly take responsibility also in that supply chain, because they hired us to make sure that that supplier would actually follow the code of conduct of Disney, to make sure that they would, it was a precondition to buy the product, the merchandising products from them. So it becomes a business must. I have another example where the company that produces the plastic bottles for Coca-Cola is not really that interested into CSR, or the owner is not that interested, to be correct. And Coca-Cola audits this company every year, and at some stage said, well, what do you have in regards to CSR? And the company said, not very much. And the next year, the same audit happened, and Coca-Cola asked again, so and what are you doing in regards to CSR? And the answer was the same. So they told them, next year we come, if you don't have anything in CSR, we will not continue working with you. And we're talking about several $100 million contract. So this kind of supply chain management has become part of how you do your business. And that's what I preach all over the world, is that CSR is core to the business. It is a precondition to actually be able to do business on a global level, even on the local level in the meantime, because the awareness of people in how products are produced is becoming more and more relevant to the decision if they will buy a product. And that again, of course, is exactly the economic dimension of sustainability, that if I'm not able to sell my products, I don't have any income and I don't have any profits, and then all the other things collapse. So just 2 words, because CSR company is probably one of the largest, at least, CSR specialized consultancies on this planet, exactly with the purpose to allow for clients to address issues in different countries in the world, from Africa to the Middle East to Southeast Asia, Europe, and we're now also in Mexico. So all this supply chain countries, more or less, we cover, and we support businesses in making sure that they can rely on what suppliers tell them, which is the challenge we'll be talking about. These are just some of our clients. Let me just get to the basics, what we're talking about. ISO 26000 defines social responsibility as the responsibility of an organization for its impacts and of its decisions and activities on society and the environment through transparent and ethical behavior. CSR as a social responsibility contributes to sustainable development, meaning sustainable development is the goal that we want to achieve, and social responsibility the day-to-day tool we use to achieve that. It takes into account the expectations of stakeholders, and of course you have to comply with the applicable laws and the international norms of behavior. But now comes the part that's relevant for the supply chain. It says it is integrated throughout the organization and practiced in its relationships. Now, it doesn't say supply chain here because when we wrote the ISO 26000 standard, the standard is applicable for all kinds of organizations, and supply chain sounded very much like a corporate language. So we used the term relationships, which is maybe even better because you have not only suppliers in the sense of companies that deliver you raw materials or whatever, but you have lawyers, you have banks, you have the company that makes the computers you're using, etc., etc. So it's a broader approach. So if you want to do social responsibility according to ISO 26000, you need to look at the practices in your supply chain, in the relationships you have as an organization. There's also some charts in the standard which try to highlight this necessity. We have the organization in the middle, the key stakeholders, employees, and the supply chain coming from the raw material to the company that then would produce products, and that then would be used or bought by customers, where we're then already in the value chain. And then beyond that are the natural, social, and economic environment, all the other players from governments to NGOs to media to the banking sector, etc., that are not directly involved in producing the product or the service, but still create the environment in which I'm able to do that. And now comes the first critical question, and that is, how far does my responsibility go along the way? Is every supplier that exists one that I need to address and look at? Or, sorry, this is always jumping. Or can I draw a line somewhere? I mean, just if you look at your mobile phone, there are hundreds of components in that mobile phone, and if the mobile phone maker would have to go down to the mines in Congo or all the other basic materials that he's using, it would be quite challenging. And actually there has been an effort to do that. You might have heard about it. There's the Fairphone, when they managed, I believe, 60% of all components to trace them back where they come from and actually look at them. But it still means that 40% have not been looked at, simply because it is so complex and so broad, and many different suppliers along the line, that it is sheer impossible. So the challenge is now for a company to decide which are my suppliers that I need to look at and which ones are the ones that I might not look at for whatever reason. And we've drawn here this red dotted line to show that maybe supplier B and sub-supplier B are within those lines that we need to look at, while supplier A and sub-supplier A are not. Now, what defines that? There's a term that we use which is called sphere of influence. There's a sphere of influence that you would have on some of your suppliers. This could be, let's say, political, contractual, or economic. Just to take an example to explain what is meant. If I'm a buyer of one of my suppliers and I buy, let's say, 80% of his production, I obviously have an economic strong point with him that if I insist on, I don't know, looking at his, if he's using child labor or something else, he will probably agree, because if he doesn't, he runs the risk of losing me as a customer who takes off 80% of his production. It could be contractual in the sense that this company belongs partly to our group of companies, or even smarter, we have already signed suppliers' code of conduct that would allow us to actually go there and look at that. And that's actually already a very important thing. It's a growing, I wouldn't say fashion, but a growing way of doing business is that suppliers have to sign a supplier code of conduct where they agree and that they will follow certain rules, certain regulations. It could be a document, maybe the UN Global Compact. It could be ISO 26000. It could be any other kind of set of rules, which in most cases is one that is developed by the buyer's company itself, which is sad in a way, because we don't have a unified process where these things could be globally also compared, because every company has a different code of conduct, and therefore comparability is always very limited, and you have audit after audit after audit, because each of them look at a different basic document. So, but still, and sorry, just to pick up the thread again, from all these signed code of conduct, now in the last 2 years, we can notice that there's increasingly also a need for actually going there and looking at the supplier. So the signature on the paper isn't sufficient anymore. You actually have to look at them. And there are, again, different ways. The company, the buyer company, can go there and look at that supplier, which is great, but leaves the door open for some criticism in the sense that, yeah, but you might be closing one eye or two eyes because this supplier is very cheap, or you have been working with this supplier already for ages and you don't want to break the relationship, etc., etc. So the whole process of the audit is flawed by an interest that the company might have to not lose that supplier. So increasingly, companies that take this seriously, they hire a third party to do the actual audit to be sure that the interest of the company in pertaining this supplier doesn't overrule any misconduct that is happening in that company. And we do quite a number of such third-party audits for different clients, and I believe it is a valuable tool, and it's especially an increasing tool. And the interesting part is, and that's kind of anecdotal evidence, that a lot of suppliers sign off this code of conduct without actually reading it. And when we then come and say, okay, and now we want to audit you, the reaction is, no, you have no way that we will let you into our factory, and there's no reason for it. You're 0.000 something of our turnover. We will not let you go. And then we pull out the papers and say, but here it says that audit visits are part of this contract, the supplier conduct, and you have signed it. And we have heard the very honest answer of one of those companies that they say, well, actually, we guess we never read the code of the supplier code of conduct, but yes, okay, we can go and have the audit. And in future, I guess they will read these codes of conduct, which is already a step forward. But it just shows that it is, you want to get the contract, you actually think only about the financials, the quantities, the qualities, but you don't think about this addendum that's there in the contract, and you just sign off things without realizing actually how important it is. And it's a kind of educational step that companies that require that are doing, and I think it's an important thing to do. So this ability to influence is the sphere of influence. So that's why some suppliers will be within my sphere of influence, and some suppliers will be outside of my sphere of influence. Just to take a classical example, I don't know, the company that provides the paper for the photocopy machine is probably outside of my sphere of influence because I buy a few boxes of paper from him and he sells to thousands of other clients as well. So he's not in my sphere of influence, but the company where we buy 80% of our products probably is within. So just to clarify that there is a line, it doesn't mean that you have to look at every supplier. The sphere of influence is the crucial line that would allow you to address the ones that you need to look at. Now, why is it important? There are several places in ISO 26000 where references to suppliers are made. One comes already in the human rights section, which is the avoidance of complicity. Avoidance of complicity simply means that you do not buy products from a supplier where you are aware of that he is abusing the human rights, and you become complicit to these human rights abuses because you are buying his products, you're giving him contracts, you're entering partnerships, etc. with that company, maybe because that company is cheaper than others because they're using forced labor or bonded labor or child labor or whatever the issue might be, and by that conduct human rights abuses. But you buy from them because knowingly that because they're cheaper than others. Of course, this is the issue of knowing that they're abusing the human rights, which again leads us back to what I just mentioned earlier, the responsibility to actually look at what the supplier is doing and not just believe in signed papers, because as we say in German, paper is very patient, and you can put it in the desk and never look at it again, while if there is a regular audit in a way, then that makes you think about these things. So avoidance of complicity is a critical point, because if you get into that situation where, I don't know, an NGO or customers or media take up an issue and it is found that you knew about these human rights violations with one of your suppliers, then you are made responsible or partly responsible for that as well, because you have provided them with contracts and bought these products. Then there is also the in fair operating practices, another reference that you should be promoting social responsibility in your supply chain. So exactly what we have just been talking about, influencing other organizations through the procurement process and the purchasing process to introduce issues around social responsibility, so to take the issue further, because that supplier probably also has suppliers. And if you include certain criteria in your purchasing and procurement policy, it requires that supplier to comply with that, and he will then make sure, hopefully, that his suppliers or her suppliers, and to be gender equal on Women's one day after World Women's Day, we need to be sure that also the sub-suppliers follow these kinds of rules. It then, of course, also stimulates the demand regarding social responsible products, because if it is a condition to buy from somebody, then if there's a request, there's somebody who will offer it. It is market rules. And in this context, maybe to highlight that there's in the meantime also a very, very good ISO standard, ISO 20400 on sustainable procurement, that exactly lays out the rules and definitions and ways of how organizations can make sure that they buy socially responsible products and include that into their procurement process. And it's based completely on ISO 26000, so it's a kind of daughter standard to this. We might touch on it a bit later. There's another, so the actions around that is to integrate ethical, social, environmental, and other issues into the contracting practices. The key thing is we're not talking only about quality or quantities or pricing. We're talking about how this product has been produced. And that's, I think, the key differentiation of the classical way of how business has been done the last few hundred years and how it will be done in the future. Because this how question is the critical differentiation tool to my competitors to make sure that we are actually having an impact, a positive impact on the environment, the society, and also the economics. Okay, so how would that look in practice? This is actually a real example from a company in Sweden that has a kind of workflow how to ensure to make sure that the suppliers follow a certain process. So if you want, this is one way. I will show you a second way in after a few minutes. One way is you as a supplier come to this company and say, we want to sell you something, or the company comes to you and says, we need a product or a service from you. But before we can enter into a contract, we have certain steps that you have to fulfill. So first of all, yes, we want to get into a business relation with you, so you get some qualifying questions. And these qualifying questions, in this case, are not around price and quantity, etc., and quality, but around your social responsible behavior. It is a self-assessment, so the company gets a questionnaire and has to fill out that questionnaire. Now, of course, there's always the risk with self-assessment that everything's perfect, everything's fine, we are the greatest social responsible business in the world. Yes, that's true, but if you have several thousand suppliers, it's a challenge how to manage that. And here we haven't signed a contract yet. We are just assessing if there is a possibility to get into a contract situation with this company. So then comes within the company a risk assessment. So we look at these suppliers, and there are certain areas that have been predefined that are risk areas, where there are potential risks, for example, for corruption, where there are certain risks of geographical risks, where you would say, okay, there are issues around child labor in this country, so we need to look at that. There could be other issues, I don't know, very bad environmental laws in that specific country, so it would create a potential risk. And that will be evaluated as low, medium, and high, and then you would send them your supplier code of conduct. And once they can still, you know, say this is also complicated and no, but if they sign it, so yes, then with the high risk suppliers, there would be then the supplier audits. So we accept the risk assessment to the low and medium self-assessment, but the high risk we would actually then audit and look at, and that would then only lead to the contract. So this is kind of a workflow that would show how such a thing could be handled in a case where you have hundreds and hundreds of suppliers that which is physically impossible to actually look at every single one. But you would have then a number of suppliers that are considered high risk, and those would only get a contract after there has been an audit conducted at their facilities. Now, I said there's also a second way of doing this, and in this case I'm showing how Marks & Spencer is doing this, with whom we have worked for quite some years now, and we're just doing another project now with them starting in a few weeks actually. The approach here is just to give you a bit of background. You probably all have heard about the Plan A and project of Marks & Spencer, which has a huge supply chain. It's, I think, 1868 or something founded company, one of the biggest retailers in the world. It buys from 3,000 factories, and that's for the garment part, apparel part, and it buys products from 20,000 farms for the food department. So definitely there are a lot of people that are influenced, and a lot of suppliers you have to deal with. Now, how do you make sure that your plan A, with which you are doing all your marketing, which with you are, it's your light tower project, which at least a lot of people know of, and maybe a good reason why to buy products at Marks and Spencer. How do you make sure that your suppliers actually follow that? And because if you look at it basically, a retail shop is an empty room with shelves. That's what Marks and Spencer provides. The products are coming from different factories all over the world, and they fill the shelves. But the customer perceives everything as soon as he enters the door to a Marks and Spencer store, that this is Marks and Spencer, and I'm buying from Marks and Spencer. So I need to make sure as a company that the products are following exactly those commitments that are made in the Plan A commitments that are there. So there is, as you can see here, that's the story of it. I think it is quite symbolic because the company started doing all this philanthropy stuff in the 80s, realized that doesn't really make much sense. In the 90s came the community investments, so one already limited things to close near to the community where the shops were. From 2000 on, it was running under the title of CSR, but it was single issues. There wasn't a strategic, holistic approach to the whole story. And then finally, in 2007, Plan A came with 100 commitments. These were then extended, and new Plan A until 2020. Now, actually, there's already a new concept for 2025 with new commitments. And so it's also a classical journey of, from philanthropy to actually addressing the business model of Marks and Spencer. And now, this is now the key thing that I want to explain. If you have so many suppliers like Marks and Spencer, you're actually continuously doing audits. If you consider audits as being the way of getting your suppliers under control. And that costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of time on both sides, on the supplier side and on the buyer side. And it is always just like you take a snapshot of the production site on that day. The next day things can be different again. So there needs to be, this is what audits are about. And you more or less go there, have your checklist, go through the shop floor there and tick boxes if things are according to whatever basic document you have chosen, if it is the supplier code of conduct or one of the international documents that are around. So the question is, does that make much sense? Because just to highlight an example, and it's a true example, in the factory in Bangladesh where I was, when you go through, there is, at every side of the door, there are 3 holes in the wall. And when you ask the factory manager why these 3 holes are there, then he says, that's easy, we produce for, let's say, Adidas, Puma, and Nike, and Adidas requests the fire extinguisher to hang at 80 centimeters, Nike at 100 centimeters, and Puma at 120 centimeters. So whenever which auditor comes, we hang the fire extinguisher at 80 centimeters, at 100 centimeters, or 120 centimeters to be compliant with the code of conduct that these companies have. Now that's not really very efficient, it's not very helpful, and doesn't make too much sense. So to harmonize that and to get away from this slapping on the finger for not being compliant with something, Marks and Spencer came up with this concept of ethical assurance. We are actually making the suppliers partners. We are trying to not be the buyer who goes there with the, you naughty boy, you haven't hung the fire extinguisher in the right height, so you get a minus, and next time we come, we will see if you have done better. But we actually try to convince them that it makes business sense for them to act in a socially responsible way, and by that help themselves and the buyer not to go there on the 3 months, 6 months, whatever basis to re-audit and check on them, but rather meet them at eye level. And we are partners and we trust each other, and we do maybe random audits, but not as, we want to kick you, but rather we want to help you improve. And the key thing is that there's an ethical sourcing department in Marks & Spencer, and if you want to be a supplier to M&S, then you cannot tell them how much you charge for your shirt or how many shirts you can produce or in which quality. But at first you have to deal with the ethical sourcing department. And they will come to you and look at your factory, look at the working conditions, look at the environmental conditions, look at the building, the construction permits, the work time, the holidays, whatever payment things. And only if they give the thumbs up, then you can start negotiating about price or qualities or whatever. So it's a turnaround of the business model. It's not the cheapest, best quality, biggest amounts that immediately gets a contract. It's the one that has all those ethical points in place, and only then we start negotiating about the price and the quantities, etc. So it's really turning the business model around, and it's I believe, one of the highlights of Plan A and the industry. And I learn now that also some other players, especially in the textile industry, are following this example and turning this around. We did this actually as a pilot in 3 countries, in India, in Bangladesh, and in Sri Lanka, with some companies there, and we trained them so they understood what it was. We let them do a self-evaluation. It was very interesting. All of them were perfect. All of them had 100%, until we had to explain to them that's not the purpose of the questionnaire. The purpose is to find out what is how the situation is. And we retrained them, and we got a much more realistic picture. And we then also did a kind of final verification of that, what they had been doing and understanding what it is. And it meant for them that they would have less audits from M&S, and it would mean that they would be preferred suppliers for M&S to be able to sell their products there. So it's exactly what it says here, aligning sustainability with the business operations. So moving away from just negotiating price and squeezing suppliers to the last cent, but creating a kind of partnership where these issues which are in ISO 26000 accountability principles, accountability, transparency, etc., but also the core subjects and the stakeholder perspective would be addressed and dealt with. So these are these pilot companies, and they defined which of the core subjects would be the most relevant to them, and then they would set up programs, actions around that, and deal with them and do improvements over the time. Which leads me to my second video that I want to show you. which is a summary of what we have been doing there.
Marks & Spencer is very excited to be the first retailer worldwide to look at implementing ISO 26000 on CSR in our supply chain. It allows us to help our suppliers and our factories to develop their own CSR strategies. It sets objectives and targets that are measurable, that reflect theirs and our commitment to social responsibility as a whole business, so it's not just the ethical or CSR team. By covering 7 principles such as transparency, ethical behaviour and stakeholder engagement, ISO 26000 allows organisations to report credibly on their social responsible activities that go beyond monitoring.
ISO 26000 taught us if you have to make your business sustainable, if you have to take your business to the next level, you have to involve, you have to take care of the interest of all the stakeholders, internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. It gave a whole new dimension how a CSR activity, which was just a part prior to this ISO 26000, become the core of the whole business process.
Marks & Spencer has implemented this project over a period of 18 months. 8 factories participated in this program, 3 from India, 3 from Bangladesh, and 2 from Sri Lanka. All these 8 factories have demonstrated the implementation of the ISO 26000 guidelines.
I saw the gap analysis beforehand, and this is just paper. If you then actually see and hear and feel this whole thing, I believe the impact is huge.
Social responsibility needs to be practiced in such a way that it is integrated into the organization. And that is what ISO 26000 project demonstrated. You can generate responsible profits by being socially responsible.
Well, that was, and actually there's a nice side story now, because this has now been 3 years ago, and now the suppliers are coming. That's why I mentioned we're starting with a new project in a few weeks. One of the biggest suppliers, and one shouldn't always think that these suppliers are like some sweatshops in some backyard. One of them, which we're going to start to work now, is a supplier with 8 factories and 70,000 employees. And the owner says, and that's why he came to us, he says, since we have implemented ISO 26000, our business has more than doubled in profits and in quantities. So I'm not sure if it's 100% only ISO 26000. I'm sure there was a lot of business quality behind it, but he is totally convinced that that was the trigger to actually do business in a better way and a more successful way. And we want to work further on this. So just to highlight, it is business. It is critical business. It is about success or failure of your business if you have your supply chain under control. That leads me to just a few words on the ISO 20400, which is the ISO standard on sustainable procurement, which is very new and is one that is going to, I believe, change a lot in the landscape of social responsibility, because it really addresses there where the money is, because procurement process is about money. And if companies want to sell to other companies or to the state, then if the procurement conditions contain these certain aspects regarding social responsibility, it will lead to the fact that these companies will try to address this. And try to comply with that because they want to sell their products. So you're actually addressing exactly the key that makes companies turn around, and that's money. And pushing the issue on social responsible procurement is a very, very important step forward. All the big international organizations have been part of the process of making it. There have been a lot of international experts participating in its development, and OECD guidelines are part of it. But it takes obviously concern of the Sustainable Development Goals, where all these 17 aspects are part of it, and it is tries to address these issues and make sure that countries can achieve these Sustainable Development Goals. And all these partners come up with a common basic document, which is the ISO 26000 standard, which is kind of the mother document to ISO 20400. What the advantages are, it's a practical guidance on sustaining supply chains. It already includes and focuses on the UN SDGs, which ISO 26000 sadly doesn't do yet. But all the basic principles and principles and core subjects, etc., are completely in line with the ISO 26000. It includes the international norms of the UN, like OECD, UN Global Compact, but also the OECD guidelines. It is easy to connect with the existing management systems like 9000, 14000, simply because, of course, a lot of companies have standards, and if you come with a new standard, a new system, it just makes things very complicated and might stop them from implementing it. But if you can easily link and connect them with the existing systems, then companies will be much more inclined to actually use them. And it assists in creating business opportunities because innovation is asked for, and if you as a startup, as a small and medium-sized business, have innovative ideas, you have much better chances of winning tenders, because that is something that ISO 26000 promotes very strongly. It provides input to sustainability reporting, of course. It's applicable for all kinds of companies, public or private. And you can, of course, customize things because not all aspects are equal depending on the size of the company, the industry that you're working in, the geography you're working in, etc., which obviously makes sense. This is the 26000 standard framework, which 20400 builds on. But the key things are the different focuses that we have here. There's an ethical focus, the stakeholder focus, content focus, and of course the process focus. This is the 7 core subjects. Some of the definitions, we look at procurement that has the most positive environmental, social, and economic impact possible over the entire life cycle of the product that you're buying. Now, this is, again, introducing something new, or for many businesses still new. It is the true cost concept. So it's not the cost of buying the product, but the cost of actually running the product, the energy costs, the repair costs, the transportation costs, how long does this product survive, etc. Taking these costs, the total costs or true costs, then the decision is much more environmentally friendly, socially responsible, because you buy a better quality, longer life cycle, less transportation, repair, standing time, etc. product. And it's not about the cheapest product, it's about the best product. And this is what this standard promotes. This is simply how it looks like. Structure, very similar to ISO 26000, fundamentals, then bridging the policies to procurement policies, organizing the procurement, and then integrating it into the organization. And this is what the Dutch delegation was very proud of. The Dutch wheel, just simply showing that coming from sustainable ideas to sustainable actions leads to sustainable results, which is exactly the importance of this standard. So just to wrap up and come to a close, what I'm trying to say is having your supply chain under control is a core business activity, and having it under control in the sense of social responsibility, environment, sustainability is a must in doing business in this period of time, because there is a more and more demand for how a product was produced, how were the working conditions. I do not want to wear something that has been made by kids. I don't want to have something that's in the news because it is environmentally damaging or whatever. Never mind what the brand or the price or whatever is. So it becomes a business imperative, and there are different approaches to it. And to wrap that up, the current one, or the easiest one, is to let suppliers sign up supplier code of conduct. The step further is to actually go and look at it as a company. The next step would be to have a third party, an independent party, auditing the suppliers to make sure that certain interests are not conflicting. And then the question is on how many and how deep you can actually go. That's why we have the sphere of influence, where we take an assessment which suppliers are the most relevant ones, where we have economic or contractual possibilities, and then look at those, maybe the ones with the highest risks. But I would also plead for looking at least at the medium risks ones as well, because of course the risk landscape is constantly changing, and you can have companies that are in middle risk that suddenly pop up with a high risk factor because things have changed over time. And then, like the currently probably, I don't know what model to call it, not to advertise some cars, but let's say the luxury model is to first have the ethical points being checked at a supplier before you actually start talking about commercial aspects, simply to exclude the risk of this supplier is very cheap, very good, whatever, but he is socially unresponsible or environmentally damaging or disregards human rights, etc. And your links to this supply chain can be very broad and manifold. If it's the human rights aspect of complicity, to support companies that you're not abusing the human rights, but in your supply chain that is happening and knowingly happening. So then you become complicit. If you're using ISO 26000 or take it serious, then also promotion of social responsibility within your supply chain is a key aspect, as it is called in all the relationships. So it is simply more and more the relevant part of business. I can say from our CSR company point of view that a lot of companies implement social responsibility, especially the big ones, of course, implement social responsibility quite well. They do it themselves. They have the qualified personnel, But the big trouble they're having is how to make sure that the supply chain does the same or thinks the same. And getting away from audits, and that's my final sentence now, is the future, because audits, in my view, are old school, if you want to call it like that. They are the, I don't know, headmaster and pupil kind of approach. I slap your fingers if you're doing something wrong, rather than we are partners, we believe in what we're doing, and it is in the business interest of both of us that we act in a certain way. That's where we need to go to, and that's where we as CSR company, in that direction, we're going to continue to work. Thank you very much for listening.
Wow, that was great, Martin. Thank you so much. And what a bold statement that we, do you mean that we don't need any auditors any longer, or should their job role change towards
the job role?
Yeah.
The job role is changing, I think. We will need auditors for sure, because they will always be the guys who, you know, try to trick the system or whatever.
Yeah.
But what we need to get away is from this kind of tick box approach with a list of things. And as my example with the height of the fire extinguisher.
Yeah, that was a brilliant example, and so true. Yeah.
It is so true, and it's still happening, and it's happening in masses, and one could actually cut down on that, and it would make the life of the supplier easier and that of the buyer.
Sure, sure. By the way, congratulations! You looked gorgeous in your turban. I like this picture very much. So, did you celebrate? Obviously, your
Yes. We had a meeting with the community there in one of the close to one of the factories.
That was amazing.
I have even worse pictures.
Yeah. Dear Martin, do you think that ISO 20400 is going to be audited as well? Will it come together with ISO 26000, or what do you think is the future of that highly important standard?
Yeah, I guess it will go in that direction. I think what I see now already is that a number of governments, especially, to be more concrete, it's a geographical thing, in the Nordics, are taking the standard already as a kind of tool for their government spending. So for government tenders, the ministries are using this 20,400 as a basis, because they want to promote social responsibility in the general economy. And as you know, states are a big inducer of business through their tenders and buying processes. So it's a very strong vehicle to get this idea across.
Sure. Great. Thank you so much. Dear participants, if you have questions, comments, please raise your hand. We can unmute you. You can directly talk to Martin. Don't be shy. Are there some burning questions you would like to ask Martin? Seize the opportunity. Okay.